Medieval kings loved to brag about their armies, but only a handful ever commanded forces so massive they changed the course of history. These weren't just crowds of men with spears. These were the biggest, strongest, and most terrifying medieval armies ever assembled, marching across continents, crushing kingdoms, and rewriting the balance of power in their time. Number 1. Harold Godwinson's English army in 1066. The year 1066 gave England the closest thing it had ever seen to a national army before the high medieval period, and Harold Godwinson's force stands out as one of the largest and most significant English armies ever assembled. Harold's military power was built on a combination of tradition, political dominance, and emergency mobilization. The core of the army came from the housecarls, elite professional warriors armed with long-handled Danish axes capable of splitting shields and limbs in a single swing. They trained constantly, lived in noble households, and fought in tight shield wall formations. Around them stood the fyrd, a levied force drawn from free English peasants and local landowners, each man legally required to bring a spear, shield, and basic armor if he could afford it. When the warning beacons lit up the English coast, Harold summoned these men from across Wessex, Mercia, Kent, East Anglia, and other regions. Harold's numbers at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and later at Hastings, are usually placed somewhere between 10,000 and 14,000 men, depending on which stretch of the campaign we examine. But what matters is that this was the largest army ever mustered by an English king before the Norman conquest, and he assembled them twice in the same month. First, he marched north in record time, covering nearly 300 kilometers in under a week to crush the Viking invasion led by Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. This march alone was insane by medieval standards. Armies usually moved slowly, but Harold pushed his men like a modern forced march, reaching York before Hardrada even realized Harold had mobilized. At Stamford Bridge, Harold's army fought in brutal close combat. The English shield wall smashed into the Viking ranks repeatedly, slowly breaking their formation until Hardrada was killed and the Norwegian forces collapsed. But the victory came at a huge cost. 2/3 of Harold's northern force either died, were wounded, or were too exhausted to continue. Before he could rest, new reports arrived. William of Normandy had landed in the south. Harold immediately turned around, marched his battered warriors back across England, and attempted to raise more fyrd-men along the way. By the time the English army stood at Hastings, it resembled a patchwork of hardened survivors, fresh levies, and desperate reinforcements. What makes Harold's army special isn't just its size, it's the impossible situation they were facing. They had just fought one of the bloodiest battles in English history, marched twice across the kingdom, and then faced a well-prepared invading force equipped with archers, cavalry, and crossbowmen. Still, Harold's shield wall held for hours, proving that the English army of 1066 was not a weak, disorganized feudal mob, but a disciplined force capable of fighting 2 major battles in less than 3 weeks. Even though the Normans ultimately won, Harold's 1066 army remains one of the most impressive English forces ever assembled, especially considering it was mobilized under extreme pressure and without months of preparation. It was the final great army of Anglo-Saxon England, and its composition housecarls, fyrd, thegn retinues, represents the last chapter of England before the Norman transformation. Number 2. William the Conqueror's English-Norman army. After the Norman conquest, England's military system changed almost overnight. William I created a new structure, combining Norman cavalry tactics with English infantry discipline. The result was one of the biggest and most reorganized armies England had seen up to that point. During the years following 1066, the king needed a large military force to suppress rebellions in Northumbria, defeat uprisings from English nobles, defend against potential Danish invasions, and secure castles across the kingdom. William's army was a hybrid. It contained Norman knights known for their lance charges, mounted warfare, and disciplined cavalry formations. These knights were heavily armored and supported by squires and household troops. English infantry provided the shield-bearing backbone of the force, using spears, axes, and early versions of kite shields. Mercenaries from Flanders, Brittany, and Denmark also formed part of William's host. When he mobilized for major campaigns, such as the Harrying of the North, his total numbers could reach 15,000 to 20,000, which was enormous for the 11th century. The Norman English army was not a single event force like Harold's. It was a permanent military machine, organized through the feudal system. Knights owed military service to the king, castles served as hubs of armed power, and every major rebellion saw William unleash thousands of troops to reassert control. When the Danes attempted to support English rebels in the years after Hastings, William deployed several large armies simultaneously, one to defend the coast, another to push the rebels into the north, and others to secure the Midlands. The sheer logistical ability to move and supply so many troops marked a radical shift for England. Under William, England became a country capable of sustaining large military operations for extended periods. Armies were no longer one-off mobilizations of local levies. They were structured, supported by castle networks, and led by professional cavalry forces with continental experience. This new system laid the foundation for the armies of later English kings and shaped medieval English warfare for centuries. Number 3. Richard the Lionheart's Crusader Army. Richard the Thersifthern, famously called the Lionheart, commanded one of the most impressive English armies of the medieval period when he left for the Third Crusade. Although the exact number varies across chronicles, Richard's total force when including ship's crews, infantry, archers and knights reached over 17,000 men, making it one of the largest English-led expeditionary armies ever seen before the 100 Years' War. What makes Richard's army unique is the level of professionalism and equipment. Unlike typical medieval armies based heavily on levies, Richard relied on paid soldiers. He sold lands, raised taxes, emptied the royal treasury, and even joked that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. With this funding, he hired seasoned knights, mercenaries, and crossbowmen from across Europe. English longbowmen were not yet dominant, but Richard had elite crossbow units skilled in penetrating armor at shorter ranges. Knights wore high-quality chainmail hauberks, helmets with nasal guards, and carried swords that reflected the wealth of English nobility. During the Crusade, Richard demonstrated his ability to coordinate massive forces across long distances. At the Siege of Acre, he commanded a coalition of French, English, German, and Templar forces numbering in the tens of thousands. His personal contingent formed the core of the English army, and they were recognized for their discipline and combat effectiveness. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard's army fought in a tight marching formation, blending infantry, crossbowmen, and cavalry in a mobile defensive block. Saladin's cavalry harassed the flanks constantly, but Richard held the line, unleashing controlled charges at decisive moments. It was one of the few battles in the Crusades where Saladin's forces were decisively defeated. Richard's army represented a turning point for England. It showed that the kingdom could not only raise large forces, but also project power across continents. His command demonstrated advanced battlefield management, logistical planning, and the ability to integrate English soldiers with international allies. Even today, historians consider his army one of the finest expeditionary forces England ever fielded in the early medieval period. Number 4. Edward the Wentus army in the Welsh campaigns. Edward the Wyrn, often called Longshanks, built one of the largest and most organized English armies of the 13th century during his campaign to conquer Wales. His forces were huge for the time, often numbering 16,000 to 20,000 men, with many being professional soldiers hired with money borrowed from Italian bankers. Edward understood that Wales was a mountainous, difficult region, so he constructed castles and supply lines before launching his full-scale invasion. The backbone of Edward's army was the English infantry, supported by crossbowmen and early longbow archers from Wales itself. Heavy cavalry made up the shock troops, capable of breaking through Welsh formations, while engineers built siege engines and fortified outposts. Edward recruited troops across England, Scotland, and even Gascony. His ability to mobilize thousands of infantry at once marked a major evolution in English warfare. England was no longer dependent only on knights and local levies. In the campaign against Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Edward used a combination of overwhelming force and political pressure. His army moved in coordinated columns, each supplied by wagon trains and coastal ships. The sheer size of Edward's military presence crushed Welsh resistance. After conquering Wales, Edward built massive stone castles, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech-staffed with large garrisons that kept rebellions under control. These castles acted as permanent military bases, allowing England to maintain large forces in the region for decades. Edward's Welsh campaigns proved that England could sustain long-term, multi-front operations with large armies. This success set the stage for Edward's next major conflict, the Scottish Wars. Number 5. Edward V Thirstern's invasion army in Scotland. Edward V Thirstern's Scottish campaigns saw England field some of the biggest medieval armies in Western Europe at the time. During the invasion of 1296, and later during the war with William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, Edward mobilized forces exceeding 25,000 to 30,000 men massive by 13th century standards. These were not just levies. They included professional soldiers, knights, Welsh archers, and large cavalry contingents. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Edward brought one of the most powerful English armies ever assembled before the 100 Years' War. His force included thousands of armored knights and a huge number of longbowmen. The first major battle where the English longbow proved its dominance. The Scottish Chiltern formations, tight circles of spearmen, were effective at stopping cavalry, but Edward's longbowmen shredded them from a distance. This combination of heavy cavalry and long-range missile troops became the signature of English warfare for the next century. Edward's massive armies in Scotland required enormous logistical support. England collected taxes, forced villages to supply grain, and requisitioned thousands of horses. He built roads, bridges, and garrisons across Scotland to sustain his military presence. The sheer size of Edward's Scottish armies demonstrated England's rising military power and its ability to project force deep into hostile territory. These campaigns were a turning point in English military history. They showed the emergence of England as a kingdom capable of raising continental-sized armies and using them with devastating effectiveness. The armies of Edward the Cyrn became the blueprint for the English forces in the 100 Years' War. Number 6. Edward III's early 100 Years' War army. When Edward III launched the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War, England witnessed the rise of one of its most iconic medieval armies. This wasn't just a force thrown together for a single battle. Edward built a professional, well-funded war machine that would dominate European battlefields for decades. By the time he sailed for France in 1339 to 1340, and again in 1346, his army structure had evolved far beyond anything previous English kings managed. Edward mobilized between 12,000 and 20,000 men, depending on the campaign, an enormous number by medieval standards. What made this army revolutionary was the mass deployment of longbowmen. The English longbow became the symbol of Edward's military power. Trained from childhood, these archers could deliver volleys of arrows with terrifying speed and accuracy. Their draw weight ranged from 120 to 160 pounds, meaning these archers had arms and shoulders strengthened like professional athletes. Edward III's command structure organized them into tight formations, protected by stakes hammered into the ground. They fired in coordinated waves, turning the battlefield into a storm of arrows that devastated enemy formations. But longbowmen were only part of the whole. Edward III also relied on heavily armored knights and men-at-arms who dismounted to fight on foot, forming solid infantry blocks. This was unusual for knights, who traditionally preferred to fight on horseback. Edward had learned from earlier Scottish wars that dismounted cavalry could form an unbreakable defensive line. The combination of longbowmen on the flanks and heavily armored infantry at the center created a deadly synergy that no European army was prepared for. Edward's logistical organization also stood out. He used England's wealth from the wool trade to hire professional soldiers, purchase equipment, and secure ships for transporting troops. His armies traveled with sophisticated supply lines, enabling them to move across France, burning enemy lands in chevauché raiding campaigns designed to break the French economy and morale. These armies marched with a purpose: destroy resources, force French armies to concentrate, and then crush them on favorable ground. Edward III's early armies reshaped medieval warfare. The victories at Crécy and the Siege of Calais were a demonstration of England's new strategic dominance. The sheer size, professionalism, and organization of Edward's forces make them one of the largest and most influential English medieval armies ever fielded. Number 7. The Black Prince's Chevauché Army. Edward, the Black Prince. The son of Edward III, commanded one of the most mobile and dangerous English armies in the entire Middle Ages. His famous chevauché of 1355–1356 and the campaign that led to the Battle of Poitiers showcased a force of around 10,000 to 12,000 men, small compared to some armies of the era, but devastatingly efficient. What made this army so influential was not just its numbers, but its shockingly effective design. The Black Prince's army was engineered for mobility. Longbowmen formed its offensive backbone, but the entire force could move rapidly through hostile territory, burning villages, destroying farmlands, and capturing towns along the way. These operations were not random destruction. They were strategic economic warfare intended to cripple the French monarchy by tearing apart its tax base. The heart of the Black Prince's force was his men-at-arms, elite professional soldiers who fought on foot during battle but traveled quickly on horseback. This allowed rapid marching, fast deployment, and the ability to choose perfect defensive terrain. When the Black Prince prepared for battle, he positioned his longbowmen in V-shaped formations or angled lines, ensuring they could crossfire enemy cavalry as they approached. At the Battle of Poitiers, 1356, the Black Prince faced a massive French army, 3 to 4 times the size of his. But numbers didn't matter. Using terrain, discipline, and archers, he turned the battlefield into a trap. French knights charged uphill into arrow fire. Chaos erupted, and French formations disintegrated. The English counterattack captured King John II of France himself, a humiliation that shocked Europe. The Black Prince's army proved that an English force, even smaller in size, could overpower massive continental armies with superior tactics, leadership, and mobility. His army became the model for English warfare for the next century. Its influence was so great that France had to completely rethink its military after Poitiers. Number 8. Henry V's invasion army at Agincourt. Henry V's army of 1415 is one of the most legendary English forces ever assembled, not simply because of the victory at Agincourt, but because of the sheer power of the invasion host that left England at the beginning of the campaign. While only around 6,000 survived to fight at Agincourt, the original expeditionary force was close to 12,000 Dersund, 13,000 men, one of the largest professional English armies up to that time. Henry's army was built on discipline, training, and meticulous planning. The English longbow had reached its peak by Henry's reign. Thousands of archers capable of launching 10 to 12 arrows per minute formed the beating heart of the army. They carried stakes to hammer into the ground, creating defensive positions against French cavalry. Men-at-arms fought on foot, wearing plate armor that provided excellent protection, while allowing more mobility than earlier chainmail. Henry V prepared his army with precision. Supplies were measured, ships loaded methodically, armor inspected, and every soldier registered. Henry demanded discipline so strict that even minor thefts were punished severely. His army was not a loose feudal gathering. It was a professional fighting force with clear command structures. The campaign took a brutal turn when disease swept through the English forces during the siege of Harfleur. Dysentery killed nearly a third of the army. Still, the survivors marched toward Calais, exhausted but determined. When they encountered a massive French force blocking their path up to 20,000 or even 30,000 men, Henry prepared for a defensive battle on muddy terrain that favored his archers. Agincourt became a symbol of English military genius. The French knights, weighed down by heavy armor and trapped in thick mud, were slaughtered by waves of arrows and collapsing bodies. English men-at-arms waded through the carnage, capturing nobles and pushing back wave after wave of French attackers. Henry's smaller army annihilated a force 3 times its size. Henry V's 1415 army remains one of the greatest examples of English military effectiveness, disciplined, organized, and deadly, despite overwhelming odds. Number 9. The Yorkist army of Edward IV in the Wars of the Roses. By the mid-15th century, England had evolved into a land of rival noble armies, but even in this chaos, Edward IV managed to build one of the largest and most formidable English forces of the late medieval era. At key moments in the Wars of the Roses, Edward mobilized armies of 20,000 to 30,000 men, with some musters reaching even higher according to contemporary sources. Edward IV's army was a mixture of retainers loyal to the House of York, mercenaries from Burgundy, longbowmen from the Welsh marches, and noble levies from Yorkist-aligned families. Unlike the earlier medieval armies built strictly through feudal obligations, Edward's forces were powered by livery and maintenance, meaning nobles provided troops in exchange for land, political influence, or money. This system created armies that were large, loyal, and ready to fight at short notice. The Battle of Towton, in 1461, showcased the size and brutality of Edward's host. Towton was one of the largest battles ever fought on English soil, with combined forces reaching nearly 50,000 to 60,000 men. Edward's Yorkist army of around 25,000 or 30,000 clashed with a massive Lancastrian force in a snowstorm. Longbowmen launched volleys in harsh winds as soldiers slipped in mud and blood. Edward personally fought in the melee, rallying his troops until the Lancastrian line finally broke. What made Edward's army exceptional was his ability to rebuild it quickly. Even after setbacks, he raised large forces for the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, demonstrating strong leadership and the political power needed to mobilize thousands. Edward IV's armies were the final evolution of medieval English warfare longbows, plate armor, billmen, household troops, and large noble retinues, all fighting in brutal, close-quarters battles. Number 10. The Tudor army of Henry VI at Bosworth and beyond. The last major medieval English army emerged under Henry V, founder of the Tudor dynasty. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Henry's army numbered around 5,000 and 8,000 men, smaller than traditional medieval hosts, but what followed his victory was more important. Henry VII built a centralized royal army that ended the era of massive noble-led musters. After Bosworth, Henry created one of the largest permanent military networks in late medieval England. He supported a trained band of archers, maintained royal garrisons, and ensured that no noble house could raise a private army large enough to challenge the crown again. During threats like the Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck rebellions, Henry mobilized 12,000 to 15,000 troops, demonstrating that the crown, not the nobility, now controlled England's largest armies. Henry VII's army marks the end of the medieval period. From here, England shifted into early modern warfare, with gunpowder, standardized equipment, and increasing reliance on professional soldiers rather than feudal levies. This final shift from noble-led armies to centralized royal forces closed the chapter on medieval English warfare and set the stage for the powerful armies England would field in later centuries.